Of course, Christianity does come out of Judaism, but not really as like much later as you'd think if you start calling Abraham the first Jew. Right? Both Judaism and Christianity are really start to emerge from basically the same cultural milieu at the same time and largely the same place. And both Christianity and Judaism are based on the interpretation of ancient Israelite texts and ancient Israelite beliefs. Right? So Judaism is a community of interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, but it's not the Hebrew Bible itself. And in that sense, Abraham was not the first Jew. Abraham was really just the first Israelite. And like, nobody tell Jacob that Abraham was the first Israelite. Right? That's an interfamily fight that they can have later. Okay. So let's get to the actual stuff. We get to Genesis 12 and the call of Abraham. Famous lines where God tells Abraham, right, go forth from your native land and your father's house to the land that I will show you. It's almost so obvious that we don't think about it, but Abraham doesn't originally come from Israel, right? There is in fact nothing obvious about that, right? Why on earth would the traditional claim not have been that Abraham was from Canaan, right? From Israel? What is gained from the perspective of the story by having Abraham come from somewhere else? So it's an interesting situation that Israel finds itself in, as a people who is sort of self-aware that they're not native to the land that they live in. Right? And this goes back in part to this, there's a myth that pops its head up occasionally in the Hebrew Bible. A myth about how did all the peoples of the world end up where they are? Is basically the question. And this comes up, a good example is Deuteronomy 32, which I'm giving to you here in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, because it is, we all think, closer to the original text. What's the story? The story is the high God, the Most High, might be Israel's God, might not. When that God gave the nations their homes and set the divisions of man, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of gods. So the notion behind this myth is there was a moment when there were all the humans and all the gods, and the high God, perhaps Israel's God, said, okay, so this people goes in this land with this deity. They belong here, and this other one belongs here, and that's how everybody ended up where they are. And this is a reasonable explanation, given its context, for why it is that people in different places worship different gods. Right? They look around. How come the Ammonites next door worship a god named Milcom? And how come the Moabites worship a god named Chemosh? And how come the Canaanites worship a god named Baal, etc.? This is why, because they all got assigned early on. But according to the story, Israel's God, Yahweh, chose Israel. So, but where they didn't have land, right? Israel knows that they ended up in this other place, in a place where the Canaanites lived, right? Because they know, even in the chapter that we're reading now, right, in Genesis 12, the Canaanites were then in the land. This is Canaanite territory that Israel is inhabiting, right? So what's happened is Canaan was assigned to the Canaanites with the Canaanite deities back in the mythic past. And so for Israel to sort of plant its seeds there, it can't be native because we're not Canaanites, right? We must have come from elsewhere. So there's an awareness in the story, an awareness from Israel of its own sort of minority status within its cultural context. And perhaps even the awareness that the worship of their God, of Israel's God, was a novelty in this space, right? People in Canaan weren't worshiping Yahweh, they were worshiping Baal. So the idea that Abraham comes from elsewhere is a common idea to all of the stories about him. But there aren't uniform claims as to actually where it is that Abraham came from, right? Famously, right, he comes from Ur of the Chaldeans, which is Mesopotamia. But right, from an equally famous passage, my father was a wandering Aramean. He seems to have come from Aram. Right? And there are definitely stories in Genesis about how Abraham's family is in Aram up to the north rather than all the way in Mesopotamia. So again, we're dealing with a tradition of Abraham having been born outside of the land, but a tradition that's malleable and can be picked up in different ways by different people in different times. None of the specifics of which matter much, right? What matters is that Abraham is an outsider. Right? And that outsider status seems to have been a matter of historical and social knowledge. And that outsider status is something of a mechanism, this whole call story is a mechanism for claiming Abraham's and Israel's right to this land. Right? Again, totally aware that the Canaanites lived here first. So why are we here? Why are we Israel in this land that belonged to the Canaanites? Because God gave it to us all the way back with Abraham. God gave it to us, and therefore we have a right to it, right? This land, he didn't give us any other land. And so despite there being others here who have a better right to it, maybe historically, we're still laying claim to it because, right, this is the land that God showed us. In other words, the call of Abraham, at least in this version, is like, it's kind of like manifest destiny, like ancient Israel style. It is worth thinking, given that analogy I just made, it's worth thinking for a bit then about the status of the indigenous Canaanites in the story. Right? Our biblical tradition obviously vilifies them. They're the enemy. They're the Baal worshippers. They're the sexual deviants, right? The Bible says all sorts of nasty things about these Canaanites. But we in America, at least, should like see this and know better from an ethical perspective, right? That we should be able to identify more, or at least we should be able to identify with the native Canaanite population that is being, in the story that Israel tells itself, is being displaced and dispossessed. Israel admits that Canaan and the Canaanites were there first. What does that mean for the fact that Israel's there now and the Canaanites aren't? The Genesis tradition here is basically a colonialist one. And the idea of the land being some sort of God-given right, we need to recognize as a rhetorical move, one that we know from the present, and one that's also quite ancient.